that the calendar sent the invitation buried in there deep. I know we're getting some questions, so we might have people popping in as the session gets started. I want to thank you for joining us today. I am Dr. Mangus. I am an educational consultant in the Patton West office. A little bit of background, I am a certified school psychologist. I studied at Duquesne University. Prior to coming to Patton, I've served in a couple different capacities. I first served in early intervention as a school psychologist. I then went into school age through the intermediate unit and worked as a school psychologist. I was hired at a local district as a contracted school psychologist, and I worked K to 12 there. And then I was hired as an assistant director of special education at a smaller district / school psychologist. Did that job for a few years before I was put in the position of coordinator of special education and student services. And that all I did before coming to Patton. So my background is school psych, but I have experience in special education and transition due to the work I did as a special education director. So I'm excited to talk with you about the role of the school psychologist. This training, actually, I feel like it's like 2 years in the making. Erica will laugh. We started this and then the pandemic happened, and here we are today with the presentation. And actually, I'm glad that we were able to delay it a little bit, because even just as recently as the PDE conference, there was a session done by Patricia Andrews of Andrews and Price that actually, I'll share some of the slides that she shared at the PDE conference about recent trends in due process related to transition and lack of information and assessment and reevaluation reports related to transition planning. And so that has direct implications, obviously, for the work that we all do as school psychologists. So I'm excited to talk with you and think through the framework of how, as a school psychologist, thinking about the NASP practice domains and then professional ethics standards, how we can think about how to support our students with disabilities through our roles in transition planning. We start every training by telling you the mission of Patton, which is to provide supports and efforts of the initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education to build capacity of local educational agencies who serve students receiving special education services. And we do that through the commitment of PDE to the least restrictive environment, where our goal is to ensure that individualized education plan teams begin with the general education setting with the use of supplementary aids and services before considering a more restrictive environment. I like to pause on this slide and think about that from a transition lens. For those of you that may or may not be aware, there was legislation passed through the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, the Workforce Innovations and Opportunities Act. And WIOA calls for the first and primary consideration for all individuals with disabilities to be competitive integrated employment. Competitive means that the individual is paid at least minimum wage and at a rate comparable to individuals without disabilities performing similar work. Integrated means that they are working with individuals without disabilities, and they are also able to be offered advancement and or benefits if those are offered to individuals without disabilities as well, and that is happening in their communities. So if we're thinking about competitive integrated employment, least restrictive environment really becomes a very important concept for students with disabilities, because if we start out the special education process by not thinking about the least restrictive environment, we're already starting a pathway of doors that might close to that individual for competitive integrated employment by not having them included in the general education setting with supplementary aids and services. So I think it's important to keep LRE in mind as we think about transition, because very often the decisions we make when we have a student in special education through an evaluation for that first time, and we're sitting as an IEP team and we're talking about the range of services that a student would receive, those decisions that are made by the IEP team at that point in time do have implications down the line for transition, even though transition is something that's really difficult for a student and for an IEP team to think about that initial time through. So what are we going to do today? We are going to learn about the requirements for secondary transition through the IDEA. We are going to make connections to the role of the school psychologist to those requirements. And then I'm going to share with you some resources to support your work. So really quickly, I want to switch for a minute and just put a link to, you should be seeing a Padlet now. So the handouts for today are on the Padlet. I know Erica is going to drop it into the chat for you. So the handouts are on the Padlet. There will be other resources that I'll share later in the presentation and go over with you how those can relate to your work. And then I also included some additional learning, some different places where you can look in order to access further resources to support your learning. So I'm going to go ahead back to our agenda. And before we get started, I'm curious, and I have a couple poll questions that Erica's going to kick off, and it's going to relate to how you currently are or aren't involved, what your perceptions of your willingness or need to participate in transition planning are. So I'm going to go ahead and have Erica start us off by kicking off the poll.
Can everybody see the poll?
We see some thumbs up. Yep.
Okay, great. So there are 7 items on the poll. Please take a couple minutes and answer those. It is anonymous. You're amongst friends and colleagues.
Starting to see the answers coming in now. Just waiting on a couple more. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll just for time purposes, and I'm going to share the results. So you should be able to see the results on your screen. So the first question was, do you believe transition planning is important? So I'm glad to see that 100% of you said yes. Obviously, you're here today, so that's a sign to me that you think it's important. Are you consistently included as a team member in a student's secondary transition development? And so not surprisingly, I think, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but 61% of you are saying, nope, not consistently included as part of the secondary transition team planning members. And we'll talk a little bit about how to advocate and why it's important for the school psych to be a part of that team and how you can contribute today during the webinar. Do you currently administer transition assessments and initial and reevaluations? So about 33% of you said yes, you do, and the other 67 are saying no, not at this point. And that might be because someone else on the evaluation team might be responsible for that, but we'll talk a little bit about the importance of the assessments in the transition planning process. Have you been asked to consult or collaborate on transition programming? So a little bit more than half of you have been included to do a consult or a collaboration on transition programming. So that's good. But we'll talk about how to get that number higher. And what has impacted your involvement with secondary transition. So not surprising, time is a big factor, right? When we're split in a lot of different directions, sometimes that becomes the low fruit on the totem pole. About 17% of you don't feel like you maybe have the expertise to be fully involved. Interest, it might not be your bailiwick. And I'll say, and Eric and I were joking before this started, in my time in the district, and I train on this very often when I train on transition. It's a do as I say, not as I did, because I wouldn't have said transition was my area of interest or passion. And I trusted that other people were doing that and that was their job and they were doing it. And we'll talk a little bit about how that can also be a big mistake trusting or not getting involved, having support from administration, and then other reasons. And then, do you believe you should be more involved? So at least half of you are saying, yes, I feel like I should, with another 33% kind of saying, maybe, I don't know. And only 2 of you saying, no, I don't really feel like I should be more involved. So it seems like obviously you're here. So hopefully you take something from today to find out different ways to be involved. And do you feel prepared? So about 83% saying, I feel somewhat prepared, but maybe need additional resources or additional support. So I feel like I'm not surprised by the results, and we'll talk a little bit about what's current research is saying. So compared to where we are, right, what we just heard, over 90% of school psychs believe that they actually should be, and that's be more involved in transition services. And that's an older study, but I feel like it holds pretty true to the test of time, right? That we know we should be more involved, and we feel underutilized with regard to transition planning, which was very comparable to what we actually saw in the results, with 83% saying they feel like they should probably be more involved or need to be more involved, and about 50% saying they weren't really pulled or utilized at all. So I feel like we're pretty consistent with what the research is actually saying about how school psychs feel. So with that in mind, I think the biggest piece to understand is what those requirements are. So understanding the requirements is the cornerstone to understanding how to be involved. And I think by having that thorough understanding of what the transition requirements are, then we can start to make those connections to how might you slide in or be more active in transition planning for students with disabilities. So I always like to start with the foundational purpose of what IDEA 2004 says. And IDEA 2004, the primary goal of it is that we are making available to students with disabilities FAPE, right? Which emphasizes the special education and related services that they need to prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So right in the primary purpose of the IDEA is secondary transition. So I joke with my colleagues and say, I'm on the initiative that is the primary purpose of IDEA, so I win. It's more important. And I'm joking, but I'm not. There is a lot of emphasis on transition, and the whole point of that IEP is what are we doing, not just to prepare those students to graduate, but to prepare them to be contributing and active members in their own education and training, their employment, and living independently in the communities of their choice. And that sits, again, right at the primary purpose of the IDEA. So important to know is that each LEA, each school district, charter school must designate someone within their special education plan that is responsible for coordinating transition services. Now, this is where it gets important. Just like with our special education teachers, they don't have to be a 1.0 equivalent for transition. So in some instances, it could be a 1.0 transition coordinator. In some instances, we see that it might be a school counselor who also is responsible for transition. In other instances, we might see that it's the special education director designating themselves as that person that's responsible, but there must be someone designated as being responsible for coordination of transition services. And then that looks really different too, because in Pennsylvania, there are no specific requirements, no specific certification, or no specialized training that's required to be a transition coordinator or to be involved with transition services and employment counseling in the state of Pennsylvania. So that creates a unique situation as well, in that that person being designated doesn't have any specific training or any specific certification that qualifies them to do this work. And so I think that's important to keep contextualized as we go throughout the training. So what is secondary transition? And this is what comes directly out of the IDEA. I'm not going to read it to you. I'm going to kind of focus on some of the bolded words. Secondary transition needs to be coordinated, and it needs to be a set of activities. And with that in mind, what we're looking for is what sorts of activities and services can we be creating for that student that's results oriented in mind. So we're really focusing on those things that that student needs to do academically, functionally, behaviorally, to help move them from current school age services and supports into their things that they're going to do after school, which include things like education and training, competitive integrated employment, continuing adult education, and all the different services that are available to them. So I think the things in bold are the things that we like to stress as an area of focus, that it's coordinated and it's results oriented. At the foundation, transition really needs to be student-centered, results-oriented, and coordinated. Just like we mentioned earlier, that there has to be a designated person in the special education plan of the LEA to say who's responsible. This idea down here of it being a coordinated effort is one that I like to stress home, because transition really is every person on the IEP team's job. It's not really one person's job. It's the student's job, it's the family's job, it's the IEP case manager's job. If you're lucky enough to have a transition coordinator, it's their job. It's the agencies that support the child's job. It's really meant to be all of the different parties working together on things that the student needs, right? Student-centered, to produce the outcomes that we need. And it's weird to me that the transition part of the IEP sits in the middle of the IEP, because I really feel like the present ed levels in the IEP are the story about where the child currently is, and the transition plan is where they want to go, right? And then the measurable annual goals are those small steps that we need to take across the bridge to get to the transition. And so all of the services, specially designed instruction, that's all part of the bridge that we build to get the child from where they are to where they want to go. And so keeping in mind results oriented is important, because results is the transition for the student. And I always say we're not guaranteeing the outcomes, but we're saying through the IEP, we are doing everything we possibly can in the best interest of this child to move their skill set to potentially obtain those transition goals that they have for themselves. Student-centered. So when we think about student-centered, the transition plan and the IEP should really be based on, first and foremost, a student's strengths. We spend a lot of time looking at IEPs in the transition initiative, and I'm sure even when you're writing your evaluations, they tend, because we're qualifying and we're looking at disability, to focus on the needs that that child has, but we can't forget the strengths and the things that they do well, and making that more of the foundation of both the transition and the evaluations that we do. We also want to make sure that we're taking into account their preferences and their interests. And these, need to be done through good, solid assessment. So we can't get student-centered data if we don't ask and use assessments that ask student-centered questions. So when we're thinking about evaluations, are we including information in the evaluation or the reevaluation that talks about the student's strengths and needs, their preferences and their interests as it relates to their current goals and their future goals? And I think this is important too. I don't like to minimize needs, because I also say at the foundation in that IEP, we need to be thinking about, how does a reading disability impact a student who wants to go to college? What impact does their disability have on their likelihood of attainment of their post-school goals? And what steps do we need to take to increase their ability to meet that goal, if that's a goal they have for themselves? So needs are also important, because we need to be thinking about the needs that they have and how does that impact their likelihood of attaining the goals that they have in their transition plan. Results oriented. In transition, we actually collect data on results. So we are looking at things like graduation and dropout rates, but we also have what's called indicator 14, which is the post-school outcomes. So in the state of Pennsylvania, we have to report to OSEP, the Office of Special Education Programs, the number of students who are participating in post-secondary education and training, the number of students who are participating in some other type of training and or are competitively employed, or the number of students who are receiving other type of employment. So those three data points are collected on stratified random samples every 6 years of cohorts of LEAs going through the indicator 14 process. And we are collecting that information to see, are students with disabilities employed? Are they attending post-secondary ed programs? Are they attending training programs? Are they living independently in their community? And that also has become more focused under the Every Student Succeeds Act. So we're starting to see some of this information being required more frequently through the Every Student Succeeds Act and some of the data that's also collected there. And then I go back to the coordination of the effort. So a big important part of transition is making sure that students and families understand the different agencies and supportive services that are available to them. And very often as school psychs, we're aware of all of the things that are available in our communities, whether it's through disability services, Office of Intellectual Disabilities, mental health services that are available, and it also vocational rehabilitation services, and helping families to understand how to make the connections to those agencies and why it's important to connect to those agencies. We have a unique skill set in that we are able to have those kind of conversations with families in a way to make them understand that it's okay that you can work with your disability, or your son or daughter can work with their disability, helping to understand that doesn't necessarily mean they'll lose access to the benefits that they have, and why it's important to get connected to those services early on so that there isn't a disruption in. So why do we have to include secondary transition? I mean, generically speaking, it's the law. But when we get down to the nitty gritty, we see that there are disproportionate numbers of students with disabilities attending four-year colleges compared to students with disabilities at an alarming rate. In fact, students with disabilities continue to demonstrate poorer employment outcomes than do other young adults. So they're working fewer hours per week, they have lower salaries, and they have reduced access to benefits. Students with disabilities are 40%, or I'm sorry, 19% of students with disabilities are likely to attend a four-year college compared to 40% of students without disabilities. And of those students with disabilities who attend, it's an even lower number that continue to matriculate throughout the whole 4 years of post-secondary education and training. So they might start out going that low 19%, but then they don't finish. And then in addition, students with disabilities are demonstrating poor outcomes as it relates to worker earnings. So they are likely to earn 64.9% less than individuals without disabilities. And it's alarming knowing that they also have a higher dropout rate. So even in Pennsylvania, where we have a better than the national average graduation rate, it's still alarming when we see the number of students with disabilities who are dropping out. We know, right, that poor access to education and training, poor lower salaries, that all contributes to things that relate to interpersonal, intrapersonal, and community and social costs. So this doesn't just absolve us, right, of our need to get them to graduate. Once they graduate, we want to make sure that they're graduating to outcomes that are meaningful, that allow them to earn a living wage, participate in their community of their choice, and really be contributing and productive members of the communities in which they live. Erica, are there any questions at this point? It might be a good time to pause.
No, just apologizing again to folks for the little issue with the hyperlink. We are recording this, so if you missed the first few minutes, it's okay. You also can still get credit, so no stress about that. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we talked about why secondary transition. When does it begin? In the IDEA, transition planning starts when a student turns 16. In Pennsylvania, I'm actually happy to say we have a more stringent policy through Chapter 14, where it should begin during the year in which a student turns 14 years of age. And that said, the IEP team does not have to wait until a student turns 14. But really, if the team is feeling like those conversations need to be more ongoing at an earlier age, to have those conversations earlier. I'll also say that under the Every Student Succeeds Act with the career readiness indicator requirements, it really does mean transition for all. We're really in a good spot that we added the career readiness indicator as a state in Pennsylvania, because that's transition for all through the comprehensive school counseling plan and through the work that we're doing, where we're starting, as early as kindergarten to begin developing an individual student portfolio that can inform transition planning based on the portfolio requirements. So if you're not familiar, under Every Student Succeeds Act, there are requirements and data points taken at grade 5, 8, and 11, that there need to be a certain number of pieces of evidence that the student has demonstrated accessing the career education and work standards. So really, transition planning is starting through that development of that career portfolio. So when a student turns 13, something that makes me excited is that shouldn't be the first time that the family has seen a product that student has done related to careers or job skills, but they really should, that information really can be integrated throughout the time that the student is in the IEP process, so that by the time they're 14 or turning 14, I joke and say, like, I remember being in those IEPs prior to 13 or 14 and saying, oh, that's transition. Thank goodness we don't have to talk about that because they're not that age. And what a disservice that really was to say, because every decision that we made did have implications. And then the look of abject horror, right? The word transition itself means change, and people are afraid of change. And so when you're sitting at an IEP meeting, a child's about to turn 14, and you're saying to a family, now let's talk about what they're going to do when they leave us, and the color drains out of their face, and they're so overwhelmed by that idea because we haven't done our due diligence and started that conversation and earlier on in the process to say, let's think about what your hopes and dreams are, student, and let's think about parent. What are your hopes and dreams? Where do you see your child living as an adult? Starting those conversations a little bit earlier so that it doesn't feel so overwhelming, or we don't get to 18 and now we're suddenly panicking because they're about to exit and we don't really have a good plan in place. So I go back to, it really should be happening ongoing throughout the educational journey. I'm a big proponent of, just because it says 14 doesn't mean that's the first time we have to have that conversation. Have that conversation ongoing, have that conversation during the initial evaluation when you're working with a child. Ask the questions about what jobs they want to do. I can tell you with 100% certainty, my career path changed about 35 times from Sunday, from the time I was 6 or 7. And if you would have told me when I was a senior in high school that I'd be delivering professional development to 128 people, either in person or on a webinar, I probably would have laughed because I had a tremendous fear of public speaking. And yet I'm sitting here doing this work now because it's the path that I fell into. So it's okay, right, that their paths change, but it's not okay to not ask what paths they think they want to go, and then to think about what can we do to help them get there. So what does it accomplish? The idea behind secondary transition is really finding ways to make different levels of education and training, employment, and independent living accessible after high school to students with disabilities, and bringing families and students on board to thinking about and jointly planning with the schools and the agencies what that's going to look like for that individual. And that really goes back to some of that data that I shared, those statistics, that when we don't do this early enough, what we're essentially doing is ensuring that that student is going to graduate and sit on their parents' couch. And that's really not our goal for any student. Graduation's a great goal, but what are we graduating students to do? What are we preparing them to do? And that's really what secondary transition and the transition plan and the IEP should be accomplishing. Really bringing the family together with the agencies, with the student, and making sure that we're developing the best plan possible to get them prepared for employment, further training if they need it, and independent living to the extent that they can. So under IDEA, there are specific requirements, and I'll show you a tool later that'll help to look to see whether a transition plan includes these components. These things are actually monitored during a cyclical monitoring. So if any of you have participated in a cyclical monitoring, either helping your special ed director or your file got pulled or you go to ask questions, there's a FSA 21A, which is part of the monitoring, and that is specific to secondary transition. And there are a set of questions that come through in the FSA 21A specific to transition, including, are there measurable post-secondary goals written in the areas of education and training, employment, and when appropriate, independent living? The other thing that's looked at in the FSA 21A is, are those goals updated annually? So what they're looking to say is, in the present levels, did the writer of the IEP show evidence that the goal either stayed the same or changed based on additional data that was collected? Those goals also need to be found in the present levels to be related to age-appropriate transition assessments. And we'll talk a little bit, and I'll show you some resources to look at different age-appropriate transition assessments. Are there services in the IEP that reasonably enable the student to meet their goal? So when we talk about services, that ranges anywhere from things that you're doing related to a measurable annual goal. So I go back to that example that I gave of a student who has a goal of attending college, but has a reading disability. Is there a service designed to improve reading to enable them to potentially attend college? It can be related services. It can be specially designed instruction. It can be other services or activities as simple as helping them to complete a college application or reviewing and editing a college essay, making sure that they take the SATs, all of those different services that help to make sure that if that's the goal, they've done the things they need to do to get there. They also need to have a course of study that's designed to reasonably enable that student to meet their goal. So thinking about, again, that goal of college, it's an easy one because there are specific trigger courses, right, that have to be taken for many colleges in order to go to college. So thinking about things like algebra and biology or a lab science, making sure that they're taking those requirements. On the flip side, a student who has a goal of being a diesel mechanic, maybe taking those courses wouldn't be the best one designed to meet their goal, but a better course for them would be to take a course at the VOTEC around auto body auto mechanic, right? Probably one of the most clean-cut examples I can give where that doesn't align is there was an IEP we reviewed, a student with an intellectual disability. She had a goal of going to earn her associate's degree in early childhood care to be able to work in a daycare. And her course of study had her attending the VOTEC cosmetology program. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the requirements for the VOTEC cosmetology program. They are rigorous. It is hard. It is really difficult to pass, and that didn't align with what her goal was. So does that course of study, and a course of study is also a projection over time, right? So I'm in 9th grade. I have this goal of working in early childhood. Do the courses I take in 9th grade and then project it into 10th, 11th, and 12th follow a sequence that would enable me to do that, right? So that course is that projection as well. Do I have annual IEP goals that are related to my transition goals? So it seems common sense, but you'd be surprised if there's an IEP measurable annual goal that isn't going to help me achieve my post-school goal. I don't really understand why it's there. Why are we writing a goal that isn't going to help me with the outcome that I have as a student? So all of those measurable annual goals that are put into the IEP should be things, right, that are related to helping me potentially achieve those outcomes. Then there are also requirements to invite the student to the IEP and to invite any agencies that are likely to provide or pay for services to the IEP with parent consent. And a little bit about parent consent. The IEP invitation serves as parental consent. So if I'm inviting the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation to the IEP because they're providing pre-employment transition services, or because the student's about to turn 18 and they're going to need VR services in order to access employment, if that's put on the IEP and the parent signs and returns that invitation, that's parental consent. Even notifying is considered parental consent. So those things are the actual facilitated self-assessment, the items that are on a monitoring specific to requirements in transition. So I'm going to go back to that slide in a minute, but before we move on, I'm going to ask you to go into the chat, and just based on understanding those transition requirements, I'm going to ask you to enter into the chat, but don't hit enter yet. We're going to do it as a waterfall. Enter into the chat, and when I say go, you'll hit enter. What role do you see yourself as a school psychologist playing now that you understand what those transition requirements are? So I'm going to put them back on. Go ahead and pull up your chat and start to enter your information in terms of that role. I'm going to give it a minute or two for people to get their information typed in. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and say hit enter, and I'm excited to see, checking IEP goals, tying expectations to developmental levels, determining strengths and needs, consulting on assessments of skills and strengths, what SDI are appropriate. Oh my goodness, you guys are, I feel like you're my people. Like I finally found my people that are getting it. The transition assessments, helping with writing of measurable annual goals, alignment, right? So making sure those IEP goals are aligned to the skills and strengths, being part of the interviewing of the student, talking to parents about the importance of independent living skills. This is great. Making sure that the student is invited and helping to facilitate their participation in the IEP process. Kind of having sat across the board in different roles on the IEP team, including my son who has a disability. It's really interesting to think about what student participation looks like and how much better a meeting would go when a student was an active participant. But they weren't active because anyone taught them. They were just active because that was their personality, or they didn't feel intimidated by the process. But the other piece is, what are we doing to help prepare students to be able to appropriately participate in their meeting and not feel intimidated? Working with the student on their goals and talking about how to obtain them, not just skipping the step at 14, starting those conversations early. Consultation, I see a lot, working with families. All great ideas. So I think we're going to be on the same page as we kind of move in to the next section, which is really talking about, now let's think about ourselves as school psychologists and how can we take an active role. And I think that really starts with when we go back to, just what is our primary role? What is the role? And when you look at, our task from NASP, we're really tasked with assisting children and youth in succeeding academically, socially, behaviorally, and emotionally. And how are we doing that if we're not helping and facilitating transition planning for them, whether it's through our evaluations, through our consultation, through our relationships with students and families? Transition really lives in all of this. Are we helping them to be prepared for what they're going to do when they leave us, and when they're not in our charge anymore? It's also important to think about our professional ethics, and really thinking about, are we approaching our evaluations, our consultations, and the work that we're doing with families by respecting the dignity and right of all persons? Are we operating from a perspective that we are presuming competence and making sure that we're working towards the best possible outcomes for our students? Are we holding ourselves responsible for learning additional information and accountability? Are we approaching our relationships with honesty and integrity? And are we doing our responsibility to schools, families, and the profession and society as a whole? And so obviously you're here today to learn a little bit more about that. I hope you walk away thinking about how being involved in transition in any capacity moves us closer to meeting those professional ethics. The other way to consider our role, and we'll talk a little bit more specifically about some of the 10 domains in the practice model. But it is through looking at the NASP practice model for school psychologists and really thinking about, the work that we do and how can we utilize some of what we know from these domains to really push our work forward in transition. And just when we went through the waterfall, I can say that I saw almost every single one of these represented in some way, shape, or form in the answers that you provided. So let's dig a little bit more specifically into domain 1, database decision making and accountability. So as school psychs, we are able to contribute to the team's understanding of assessments and how they relate to the transition planning process. So whether we're giving intelligence or achievement tests, different personality measures, adaptive behavior ratings, social skills assessments, you name it, any type of assessment, if we can help the IEP team to understand how all of that data contributes to what we know about a student and how that could impact transition planning. We can also be using data to make predictions about how that student will respond in different vocational settings. So if we have awareness that certain behaviors are present and they're triggered by certain antecedents, how might that look in an employment situation? What supports might be needed to ensure that those behaviors or the likelihood of those behaviors decrease or don't happen in that vocational setting, and what do we need to consider? And then also what areas of identification for intervention could be found through the work that we do prior to putting students in jobs or residential placements. And this is all coming out of work that was done by Lillenstein, Levinson, Sylvester, and Brady in 2006. There's an article, I'll add it to the Padlet because I think it talks a little bit more in depth, and is a good resource for you to have as you think about your role. The next domain really is our consultation and collaboration. I saw a lot of that popping through the chat as well. As school psychs, we're really poised to lead in-service workshops, whether it's on learning, behavior, adolescent psychology. But the other unique skill set that we have is facilitating team problem solving. And so the question that was in the poll about, have you been brought in? Have you been asked to consult or collaborate on a transition plan? And I think about 50% of us said, yes, we have. We really are poised to think and lead problem solving thinking when a student is either encountering maybe a barrier in an employment setting or in the educational classroom, and really help the team to kind of brainstorm and come up with creative solutions to that. And to think about the training that you have as a school psych, the breadth and depth of training, and how that can impact making or thinking about things like specially designed instruction and related services, modifications and adaptations that a student may need. And then also, we have a skill set where we can look at what are barriers to fidelity of implementation of an intervention and making sure that, across environments that intervention is being implemented with fidelity. A good observation in an employment setting or an employment opportunity for a student can go a long way, and making sure that that the team is collecting the right data about a student in employment setting. So anywhere from training, problem solving, looking at fidelity of implementation, but also looking at the data collection that is being done, and are we getting good, meaningful data to say whether something's working or not working. Other ways that school psychs can be involved is direct service. So things that may be part of your repertoire. So different social skills trainings that could relate to skills for transition. When I was in the district, I did a group with our speech and language therapist where we worked on interviewing skills. So I was taking it from the social emotional side. She was working on her speech and language goal side, but we were collaborating together to work on those skills needed for employment, asking for help, et cetera. Another skill set that we have is parent training. So I saw into the chat people talking about collaborating with families and helping families to understand independent living skills. I sit on our what used to be called Achieve, which is programs for students with autism who will be going into college settings. And in Achieve, some of the problem solving that we do is around, if your goal is to go to college, but mom is still waking you up at 17, or you don't know how to do laundry, but you want to live on a college campus, that's an independent living skill. And very often those are the things that we see, not included in a transition plan, but maybe need to be included in order to make that a likelihood for that student, right? And then looking at what areas are needed for intervention and helping to find appropriate interventions that would be appropriate to match that need, right? So what intervention is needed based on the needs that the student has. Also looking at domain 9, which is our program planning and evaluation, we are uniquely poised to, with a skill set to do programming and evaluation, and really looking at, does our program actually do what, are we actually getting students into outcomes? Are we giving them the right skills to go into those outcomes? Do we have an assessment protocol that looks at transition? So really thinking about within that domain 9, the skills that we have to either look at our transition programs in general, or even just the assessments that we're doing of students, and making sure that we have, a continuum of assessments that measure different skill sets that can be of assistance for transition planning. We talk about in the transition initiative that there are steps to purposeful secondary transition, and it all starts in assessment. And very often in the district, we are, the only ones who are as grounded in assessment and training in assessment. So at times that assessment needs to happen in the evaluation report or in the reevaluation report. That assessment really needs to be the driving force behind the creation of the present ed levels. It needs to include information about what that student's post-school goals are. So did the assessment get us information about what they want to do related to employment, post-secondary and training, and independent living? And then within the transition plan, are we designing a course of study? Are we designing services and activities that really help the likelihood of increasing that? And then are we aligning measurable annual goals and progress monitoring to support movement towards that? And it's an iterative process, right? Transition planning isn't like a one and done. We assess one time and we never revisit it. It's meant to be an ongoing assessment process through collection of data, through formal and informal assessments, through interviews, through observations, that really evolves over time. Just in the same way that I said, my career path has changed from what I would have thought when I was 6. It's okay that a career path changes, but how are we documenting those paths in the IEP and documenting the progress that that student is making and using it to tell a story about growth and change over time? So in terms of assessments, we've mentioned that they need to assess strengths and needs, they need to assess preferences, and they need to assess interests. Age appropriateness, there's 2 ways that this looks in the IEP. First and foremost, if it's a norm reference test, is that test actually, or is that assessment actually aged and normed for that age group? So if I'm giving the WISC when I should be giving the adult intelligence assessment, that's not age appropriate. But in the same way, if I'm giving a scale that isn't scaled to someone that age, then it's not age appropriate. It's also not age appropriate if I don't document the date that I gave it. So a monitor, a BSC advisor is really looking at what date did I give that transition assessment. If I gave a strengths and interest inventory, but I don't talk about it in my present levels, and I don't actually say I gave it on March 22nd, 2022, it's really hard to say, was that an age appropriate assessment? So documenting age appropriateness comes into, if you're using a norm reference test, using the right one, but also dating when you gave the assessment. And all of that should be considered in the construct of what are the demands of current and future working, current and future educational and training, living in personal and social environments. How do all of those things?
I am good. So I have several questions.
How do all of those things contribute into what that individual wants to do when they leave high school. So how can you as a school psych contribute to transition assessment? We're going to spend some time looking at some different tools that measure aspects of transition assessment. Other recommendations I have are incorporating transition assessment into both your initials and any reevaluations that you're doing. And really it comes down to the training that you have in interpreting results in a meaningful way, but also how do those results impact their post-secondary education and training, employment, and independent living. And that's a skill set that school psychs have that other members of the IEP team don't have, is the interpretation of results. So I think this is probably one of the most important roles that we can play, is helping to make sense of all the data, even if you're not the one always giving the assessment, helping the team to think about what does all of this mean in the grand picture of the student and what they want to do. So there is a legal basis that's kind of coming out of some cases that have been happening in Pennsylvania. This comes from the Trish Andrews presentation at the PDE conference this month. And we asked her to present on current trends in due process related to transition. So in GW versus Downingtown Area School District, and if you're here and you're from Downingtown, I'm sorry. This is all kind of just as it was presented by Trish. It's not meant to say somebody did something right or wrong. I'm presenting as Trish presented what the hearing officer's decisions are. So what was the kind of synopsis of the case from the hearing officer's perspective, and what was the result, or what was the ruling? So in that case, the parents alleged that the evaluations that were done by the district were deficient, and that led to an IEP that was not reasonably calculated to provide the student with FAPE. So there was an RR done in 8th grade, and the parent argued that it was inappropriate because the transition assessments were not included. So think right about our transition requirements, 13 turning 14. Most students in 8th grade are in that age span where this should be, considered. The ruling basically found that omission of transition assessments was inappropriate, that the district did not have a systematic objective assessment of the student's transition needs to either support its transition plan or suggest any changes to the transition plan. The hearing officer ruled that the district did not gather the necessary information for the appropriate IEP development, and as such was a denial of FAPE. They were ordered, the hearing officer ordered an assessment and 30 minutes of comp ed for every hour the student attended school for that entire year. So this one was interesting to me because they were saying that even at that young age, that beginning foundational age, that reevaluation that was done, whether it was by a teacher, a school psych, I don't know who wrote the reevaluation, but that assessment in and of itself didn't have transition assessment in it. And for that reason, they were found to be denying FAPE to that young person. And that becomes costly. 30 minutes of comp ed is costly, as well as, doing an evaluation or paying someone else to do a transition assessment or evaluation that should have been done as part of the reevaluation anyways. So thinking about expanding your role from an assessment lens, you can integrate assessments to transition goal areas. So how does the student's cognitive, adaptive, behavior rating scales, interviews, any observations, how does that relate to those goal areas? And how can you collaborate, right, in the transition planning? So thinking about things like doing assessments on a job site or observations, helping to formulate what evaluation tools or data is going to be needed for a particular student, and what interventions are appropriate based on that student's strengths and needs. Other potential ways to contribute, helping with the development, implementation, and monitoring of those post-school goals, and making sure that the present levels in the IEP from year to year talk about how the student did in their attainment of their goals, whether the measurable annual goals, whether it's an activity that they were supposed to do. I think one of the biggest things we hear monitors say is they'll see a student's transition plan, and let's say taking the SAT might exist in their in 10th grade and 11th grade. It's not to say that it's not appropriate, but in the present levels, if we didn't address why that stayed the same, why it didn't change for that student, making sure that those present levels talk about it. Maybe they took it in 10th grade and they want to obtain a higher score, so we're going to leave it in 11th grade. Or maybe they were sick the day they were going to take it in 10th grade, and so they never took it, and so it's staying in. Why are things either being included as services and activities, staying the same, or changing, and talking about what implications that has, and making sure the present ed levels reflect that. Helping to make sure that there's a comprehensive evaluation that includes transition assessments and that the assessments are interpreted. Other ways for school psychs to be involved is working with teachers, families, counselors, the adult agencies to help implement the transition plan. Designing and implementing and looking at progress with interventions, monitoring the transition plan implementation, helping with student skill development related to their transition needs, supporting students and families. Another area that's really big is helping to link students to appropriate augmentative assistive communication devices or assistive tech, and collaborating with interagency work with the different partners. So those are all potential ways that you can contribute as a school psych. So I want to spend some time now showing you some different resources that I included on the Padlet, but I do see some questions. Erica, did you want to, before we move into the resources, do we want to go through any of the questions?
Yeah, so one question was, can we include OVR or another agency on the IEP invitation if a parent signs the IEP invitation that gives us permission to invite the agency to the IEP team meeting?
So I'll say from a compliance lens, yes. From a best practice lens, here's what I would say to you. I would be working with that family, whether it's through a personal conversation, an email, a phone call, to say, we're having your student's IEP, there's this agency, OVR, here's what they do. We'd like to invite them. I'm putting them on. Do you have any questions? Like, I mean, just in the same way that you wouldn't want someone showing up to your doctor's appointment and being in your doctor's appointment with you that you didn't know why they were there. You know, families need to understand why someone's being invited, why. So, you know, from a compliance lens, yes, you're meeting the compliance requirement. If you put their name on the invitation, check the box, send the invitation, and it gets returned, right? But from a best practice, I would say operate from what would you want someone to tell you if that was your child or your son or daughter. And then I just see Daniel put in for me, I'm going to put it in for everybody, a link to a book written by a school psychologist about career awareness. So I'm going to throw that into the chat for everybody. It looks like it'll be a good, oh, that's not the right one. And then I see one about the grid. Erica, I don't know if you see that one. It might have come.
Yes, I do. The transition grid and the IEP where post-secondary, independent living, and employment goals are listed. Do those goals need to be specific and measurable, or just tied to a specific and measurable goal in the goal section, located in the goal section of the IEP?
So transition goals are not measurable annual goals. So that's a great question. So they don't need to be written in the same way that a measurable annual goal needs to be written. They do, however, need to be linked. There should be a measurable annual goal that would support that, right? So there's a box in the grid that says, is there a measurable annual goal aligned to this? And you check yes or no. So if you're writing a post-school goal, you should be including a measurable annual goal that is aligned to it in some way, shape, or form. Measurable post-school goals are written in a way that occur after a student leaves school. So Erica has a goal to attend a four-year college or attend college, right? Goals start out really generic when a student is first going through transition. So Erica has a goal to obtain further education or training after graduation would be an appropriate goal. As they get older, the goal can get more refined, right? You may have a more clear-cut plan that Erica wants to go to college versus going to a VOTEC program or going to an adult day program, right? But starting out, they tend to be kind of generic and broad, and they refine as we go through and collect more information. And that's why transition assessment is so important, because if we're not taking good assessments and we're not doing good data collection, how are we refining that goal for that student? Anything else in the, okay. So I'm going to switch out of the PowerPoint and jump to the Padlet, because the wealth of the resources lives on the Padlet. And I'm going to take some time to walk you through each of the different resources. So the first one I want to show you is a new website, pasecondarytransition.com. This website was jointly funded by the Bureau of Special Education and OVR, but it is an interagency collaboration. So it is actually the work of our PA Secondary Transition Community of Practice. That's a group of stakeholders from education, OVR, higher education, the Office of Developmental Programs, the Office of Long-Term Living, family organizations, youth organizations. We all come together several times a year, and this is a product of some of the work that we do specific to transition. And I'm going to move my camera, sorry. So you, on this website, you can do a couple things. You can learn about all the different partners. So if you're not aware of all of the different agencies, this is a great place to learn about the different agencies. The other thing is that this policy section actually walks through different legislation that is not just educationally based, but maybe related to OVR or the Office of Developmental Programs, that all kind of have a focus of secondary transition and really call for us to work across systems to do the work in secondary transition planning. So you can kind of see there's just generic or general information about transition. There's information. We have a new memorandum of understanding with OVR to support youth with disabilities, and information about effective transition planning and different resources that are available to you. The other piece is the framework that exists here. So this website is definitely geared more towards professionals, so educators, OVR caseworkers, any adult providers that are working with youth with disabilities, but we're using the Transition Discoveries framework, and Transition Discoveries comes out of research done at George Washington University through a Developmental Disability Council grant that looked at surveying youth, families, and transition vested parties to say, what are the components, what things need to happen in order for a transition program to be effective. And so that research led to 9 indicators, which are what are listed here. So good transition programs should focus on transition planning, should focus on youth development, person-directed planning, all the way down this continuum. And then if you hover over any of them, you get the sub-indicators that are tied in here. When you drill down, for example, into any one of these, you can actually find resources, definitions, videos, how can adults support, what are the skills that are needed. So you can kind of use this educationally, either for yourself or for students and families that you're working with. But then you can also see additional resources, latest events around transition, and then specific resources in the bottom. We talk a little bit about the audience of transition. The other thing that's really great is we have a shared events calendar. So anything that's happening in transition, whether it's through Patton, whether it's through the Peel Center, ODP, Pennsylvania Youth Leadership Network, we all share this calendar and put those events into here. So there are lots of opportunities, both for youth, families, and other vested interested parties to access this calendar and access these different opportunities to learn about different aspects of transition. So that's definitely a nice feature. And then we have our news and announcements where we publish a monthly newsletter about all things transition, and you can back read the different editions. And then any other kind of like announcements or anything that come out from our partners, we use that as well to put that information out. The really great thing about it, though, is the resources page. And so this is where I wanted to spend some time with you because we have lots of different resources that exist for youth, families, and transition professionals you can see up at the top, it'll tell you what type of resource it is, but you can do search specific things. So you can actually search if you're looking for a resource around career exploration and planning. You could go all the way from the indicator to the sub-indicator. You can also search by the different OVR, pre-employment transition services, or the type of resource. So this website has things like different curriculum, different assessments, lesson plans, tip sheets, websites, videos, presentations, toolkits, guides, you name it. There's, a plethora of resources. For the purposes of our time today, I wanted to just show you the assessment feature so you can find different transition assessments that measure different skills. Some of them are free, some of them are at a cost. If it's something that costs, it'll take you to the website where you can learn more about it and or how to order it. If it's free, it'll take you directly to the actual assessment itself. So you can see, there are just, a pretty good number starting out of assessments that you could be using or including in your transition assessments within your evaluations and reevaluations. And this is actually going to get enhanced soon. This section of the website is actually going to become its own drop down under resources, so assessments specifically. And we're going to share some different resources that I'll show you on the patent site that will help pinpoint different ways to look at building your transition assessment portfolio across your grade levels, and then making considerations for what type of assessment you might need for a particular student. So that's the website, and that's a really nice resource if you're looking to get started on adding some assessments.
Can we take a real quick pause for some questions that
absolutely
tie into that discussion on assessments? So there are two kind of similar but a little bit different. First question, at what point does transition assessment become formal and require parental consent? And then the next question, how do we incorporate transition needs as part of RRs?
So in terms of transition assessments, because it's required to be addressed through the IEP, typically it is considered an informal assessment process. In the same way that you might be taking curriculum-based assessments, a lot of informal transition assessments can be given without parent permission. If you are looking to do something unique or that is norm referenced or that might be used for decision-making purposes, I would suggest including those on your permission to evaluate or reevaluate. If it requires a more specific training, if it's more formal. But that being said, for the majority, because it's a requirement to be updated in the transition IEP annually, anything kind of informal or that you would do for any student, you can be doing ongoing without parent permission. And then I see another one, or did I miss it? No, okay, that one's it. Sorry.
Yep.
I hope that answered. Yep. And then incorporating that into the evaluation. When you look at the annotated form, there is a lot of places where you could be putting that transition assessment. So thinking about things like, how does the student's disability affect the progress in the general education setting? What supports and services does the student need? What are the student's strengths? You're collecting some of that information in the student's strengths. You're collecting information that impacts transition when you give an IQ and an achievement test. So how does their general functioning and how does their reading, math, writing, social skills, any of that data that you're collecting, how would that strength or weakness impact their post-secondary goals as well? So to that extent, I would be looking at the annotated RR or ER and finding where there are pockets by which you can contribute. But ultimately, I would make sure that you're assessing it. And I go back to that GW case specifically because when you look at the Office of Dispute Resolution and the number of occurrences of due process that have a transition hearing, it's probably one of the most trending issues in a due process is secondary transition, especially following the pandemic, that it, protect your district, protect yourself, do the assessment and incorporate it into the evaluation. And it does. There is an actual section in the IEP and the present levels of academic and functional performance, where they ask specifically about transition assessments and transition goals, and how, incorporating that information. So it is directly referenced in the IEP document itself, but there is reference in the evaluation document as well. Okay. So the sister site and the research behind the 9 indicators and 55 sub-indicators is our partnership with Transition Discoveries and George Washington University. We're actually implementing Transition Discoveries as a state, as our effective transition practice. It is an evidence-based way of looking at your transition program overall. So we talked about how can school psychs use data and program evaluation for assessing an LEA's transition framework. And this is really the way that we're doing it. So in Pennsylvania, we partner with George Washington in our intermediate units. We have all of our intermediate unit transition TAC trained as facilitators in transition discoveries. We have offered stipend funding to LEAs. We have 17 LEAs implementing transition discoveries this year. What that involves is stakeholder surveys, so youth, families, and other transition partners, professionals, our school staff. We're having them give a survey to find out what are their specific within your LEA, what are the strengths and weaknesses within your program, and then how can you form a team, we call it the TCAT team, Transition Change Agent team, of youth, family, and community members and people vested in making the transition program better, to create an action plan based on what's currently happening, what do we wish was happening, and what could we realistically implement based on our strengths and needs. And so that's what Transition Discoveries implementation looks like in PA. But this site is really designed with youth and family in mind, and is written to be used as a tool to teach youth and families about the transition process and about what all of the different, things mean. There are resources for youth and families. There are ways to connect with them. They have blogs, event stories, and galleries, but they really do kind of take each section and write from a youth reading perspective, and there are like little videos that can be used. So this is the complement to the professional website of PASecondaryTransition.com for youth and families, and can be used to really help. And when we talk about like working in a consultative role or working from a skills training role for youth with disabilities or families, using this website to help them understand the transition planning process. So I think that that's something also that can be of help to you. And they also have resources on their site. So in the similar way, they have things like lesson plans, tip sheets, websites, presentations. They have them in English and Spanish. I should also mention PASecondaryTransition.com will be translated into English. It's English and Spanish currently, but then we'll have the other 10 most commonly occurring languages of students with disabilities in Pennsylvania. So they're working on all of those translations now. I think Chinese, Mandarin, a few other different languages are included in that translation. So that website will have those translations as well. And then some of the other resources I put here specific to transition assessment is a link here to a Google Drive, and we'll talk about both of these on that Google Drive. Transition assessment matrix and a transition curriculum matrix. So those assessments that are on PASecondaryTransition.com and the curriculum all were derived from this. But what is helpful is that there are some other tools that you can be looking at. So one of the really cool things is this assessment connection grid, where on the top of the grid are different transition assessments. To the left, and each tab has a different thing, but on this tab in particular, you can see current and future employment in different domains that can be assessed there, education and training in different domains that can be assessed, independent living. So anywhere where there's a 1 means that that test measures that domain, right? And so you can get a sense as to, are there assessments that maybe are going to give me more bang for my buck, right? If I need something that's going to assess a lot of independent living skills, I might look at something like the informal assessment for transition, independent living, and community partnership. I might look to purchase that because that's hitting, all of these different domains. So the other ways that we've looked at it in the assessment domain is we have also done that work with the assessments as it relates to the transition discoveries indicators and sub-indicators, right? So if I want something that's going to look at career exploration, planning, and preparation, I can see that there are several assessments that hit that particular skill. And I might look at one of those if that's something that I'm looking to collect information on. We also mapped it against the career education and work standards. So some of the assessments obviously are going to cover more of the career education and work standards than others. And then we did the same thing with the pre-employment transition services. So we did that with assessment. In the same way, some other resources that would be helpful is this template for a mapping guide. So we mentioned ways that school psychs can be involved. It might be making sure that students get assessed across 7th through 12th grade in these different areas on these different skill sets. So am I, for a particular student, what assessments am I going to give in 7th grade versus 8th grade? And how is that going to look different to when they're in 12th grade? And did I cover all of those domains for a particular student so that I have that comprehensive picture of what the student should, be able to do as it relates to current and future employment, education, and independent living? And then in addition, we did sample work. So these resources here are a review tool that you can look at different transition assessments, ways to critically think about those assessments through that, and just different resources that are here for you in that folder. And then in a similar way, we did that work with transition curriculum. So really looking at across different curriculum, how does specific curriculum going across the top align to, in this case, TD is first, the career education and work standards. Ooh, there they are. So if I was looking for something in particular that maybe is a broader stroke, I might want something that hits 16, right? So if I'm looking, I can say that this building your future is aligned with 16 of the career education and work standard indicators, sub-indicators. So we have that kind of mapped across pre-ETs, across cred work standards, across transition discoveries. We also aligned it to the National Network of Business Industry Administrators employability domains. So different personal people skills, workplace skills, and applied knowledge to really get a sense as to do these assessments really, or does this curriculum, what is it covering and what skills can I expect it to be aligned to? So you can kind of, depending on what you're looking for, find curriculum or find assessment that is really going to help address or answer questions or address a need that a student has. And then the last tool is specific to FSA 21A or indicator 13. And so, another way that you can be helpful is using this sort of checklist to make sure that the component pieces that are being asked during a monitoring. So it has the indicator 13, the file review 21A question, where should you look for it and whether it was there or not. You can use this as you kind of sit in an IEP meeting to help facilitate and make sure that you're meeting all of the FSA 21A transition requirements. And so those are some of the main resources that we're using within our transition initiative to facilitate. One of the things I would say is, we will be offering money or stipend funding again next year for transition discoveries implementation. It is actually going to increase this year. It was $7,500 it's actually going to increase pretty substantially. So something to think about if you're looking to be a little bit more involved with transition might be working with your school district to go through the transition discoveries process and learn a little bit more about that when we announce it in the late summer, early fall. And then some of the other resources that I put here for additional learning. During the 2019-2020 school year, we did a webinar series, a cross-agency webinar series on transition assessments. And so there is one that overviews transition assessment and how to use it for transition planning. This tool actually that's in the resources is a really nice tool. When we talk about the transition planning domains, I want to take a minute to highlight it because if it's going to open. Because it does do a nice job. And it is evidence-based. So this work comes out of work done from the University of Kansas through the Transition Coalition. We mentioned like looking at what areas of information do we know and what might we need to assess from a student. So making sure that our transition assessment answers those questions. This tool is really designed to look at what we already know. What do we need to know as it relates to each of those domains? How might we get that information? Who's going to do it? And when will it be done by? So this transition assessment planning form is talked about in that webinar, and it really goes through making these considerations when you're looking at, deciding upon a transition assessment for incorporating transition assessment data. The other two webinars, the one from December goes through how OVR uses and collects data, which is important because if you have students working with OVR, but you're not accessing that information or incorporating that information into the IEP and into the evaluation or reevaluation, this will help understand, what are their requirements, how can you get a release sign to access that information, et cetera. And then we were supposed to have one with Office of Mental Health, but then they canceled and then the pandemic happened. So right now there are the two. One is the overview of assessment and one is from Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, but it's a really informative series that will help you understand more about transition assessment and the way that our partner through OVR uses it. Another really helpful tool is the Transition Coalition. They have a plethora of resources available on their website. You could create a free login and password. And it is like I feel like it's like a little MS-DOS looking or like 1980s computer skill driven. But the content is really good content. So you can actually take a whole module on transition assessment, understanding the purposes of it, different types and approaches, understanding this might answer that question, right, of formal versus informal and when do I need permission versus not permission, and then the assessment process. I find as a school psych, our training aligns really nicely with just our general assessment practices to transition assessment. So sometimes when I take them, I feel like I'm taking a course that I could have taught just by understanding transition or by understanding assessment and how to incorporate assessment data from the evaluation. But it's also helpful to maybe use in working with team members that might need a little bit more training or technical assistance. And then there are some other places that you can look. So this identifying assessments is a great resource where you can look at academic behavioral screening tools, progress monitoring tools, and different diagnostic assessments that might help you. So you can kind of use these to kind of tier and build your assessment protocol, your evaluation protocol, and your diagnostic assessment protocol. So it's a nice resource in that way. And then the other one that I wanted to talk to you about is the National Technical Assistance Center for Transition. So NTAC, the collaborative, is a national federally funded through OSEP and OSERS organization. They have a ton of trainings, a ton of resources on here where you can, you could literally spend hours looking at all the different resources related to secondary transition, student youth engagement assessment, you name it, they kind of have everything on here. They also have tons and tons of archived webinars and upcoming trainings, so you can kind of scroll down to the bottom to access things that might be coming up. So understanding and using data to improve outcomes for students with disabilities, that's one that's going to take place in April. These are all great resources that you could be using to get additional training or supports as it relates to secondary transition. And then we also have information on the patent site that I just wanted to take a moment to show you. So there are some things here. You can learn about things like our grant opportunities, how to engage families in transition planning, what are the different laws around secondary transition, tools for planning for the future. You can learn more about transition discoveries, effective and compliant transition, post-school outcomes and different trainings, how to stay engaged with hard to find youth, archived webinar series, and different trainings that have happened across the years, other transition related resources, and then information about our upcoming conference. So I did want to take a minute to plug our 2022 transition conference. We are going to be at the Penn Stater in August, August 10th and 11th. We are a unique conference because we are one of the only conferences that has youth with disabilities, family members, and professionals and agencies all attending the same conference. There will be youth and family scholarships, so that's something else I would encourage you to keep a lookout for, is maybe giving information to the youth and families in your school district about attending the conference. They can have their conference registration fee waived, their hotel is covered, and then the Peel Center will actually be offering reimbursement, a certain amount of our stipend if the family lives 50 miles or greater from the Penn Stater, to cover some of the other expenses. So it's a really unique conference. There is a lot of youth engagement in the conference. We have the Pennsylvania Youth Leadership Network. They will be running a youth panel. And in addition, they will also run a youth event in the evening. It's been a dance, it's been a trivia party, it's been like a carnival theme. They kind of do a different thing. They did an escape room one year, all really different creative ways, but it's also an opportunity for youth and families to learn about the transition process side by side with professionals and have access to that same information. We also have just different resources here that are specific to transition. So tools for job coaches for presuming competence. The benefits counseling toolkit is a new tool that we worked on with our stakeholder group to help families and youth understand that they can work and still collect their disability benefits in some instances, and how to access those different resources. And then tons and tons of just other tools that help facilitate the conversation with youth and families about, why they should work with OVR, what does it look like to invite OVR to the IEP meeting, et cetera. So I'm happy to share these resources with you. I'm pleased that you guys want to have access to them. This Padlet will not go away. So the resources will stay there for you. I always bookmark when someone gives me a Padlet with really cool things. I bookmark it up in my search bar up here so that I can come back to it. But really, there are a ton of things out there. And if you're just starting out, I know I always say I'm intimidating. I think sometimes because I'm excited about the work that I do, I'm passionate about the work. More so now that I even think, this is, again, what the primary purpose of IDEA is to provide these supports and services. And so I like to share as much as possible so that everybody can come back to it and take a little bit at a time and really get to explore and dig deeper into it, so that you can start to think about ways you would be involved. So with that being said, we're kind of approaching the end of what I have. I'm going to leave time for questions for sure, but as we're transitioning, I want to know, what is one action step you might be committed to taking, having seen the different resources, having heard the different ways you can be involved? Enter into the chat something that is one step you're willing to take now having heard about transition and the roles that school psychs can play in transition. And you don't have to wait for me to say go, just go ahead and start entering into the chat. Learning about new assessments, for sure, that's a great goal. Incorporating assessments into your ERs, yeah. Taking time to just look at the assessments and the resources. Assessment looks to be a big one. Consulting about current practices. Katie, if you want to do that, maybe look at transition discoveries next year. Getting your supervisors to support it. Maybe you can show them the recording of this to hear why they should buy you more testing. Looking out for resources and reaching out to programs to help make people more aware of the transition conference. Great. A framework for transition assessments. Perfect. Looking into working with case managers on how to engage students in the planning. I didn't put everything that could go under there, but certainly for engaging students in planning, the transition discoveries resource is going to be a great one for you for that, to be able to look at that youth development framework and the resources that are there to really support youth in being more involved. Working with transition coordinator for incorporating assessment. Yeah, I mean, I think if you have a transition coordinator, you're lucky because not everybody even has that full 1.0 transition coordinator. But building that relationship and working together to use the assessments and develop that assessment portfolio is going to be great. Including students in the process of identifying goals. Yes, yes, right? Because if a goal is created and it's not meaningful, how likely are they going to be willing to work on it? Or if they don't understand the connection to how does this goal relate to my own goal of what I want to do, why would I bother working on it? Great point. Okay, I'm going to open it up. Feel free to enter any questions that you might have into the chat, or you feel free to unmute. I'm happy to answer questions. I talk about 1,000,000 miles an hour, but I wanted to make sure I left time for questions.
There are a couple back here that I'm going to pose to you, Hillary, as people are thinking about their questions. There was a lot of discussion, one about Naviance. I am not familiar with Naviance. And then there was another question about using HIPAA forms for collaboration with mental health providers for transition. So I just wanted to capture those before the chat floods.
So we had Naviance in the district that I was a special education director in. That is definitely a program that has different assessments. One of the things, and certainly the work that's being done by your school counselors can and should be considered in the context of transition. So I want to start first and foremost by saying, like, yes, thank you for making that connection, because why are we repeating things that have already been done, right? If your school counselors are capturing different pieces related to assessment, why do we need to reassess or do a similar assessment? Take that information, know where to find it, know what to ask for, and put that into your evaluations or your reevaluations. Make sure that that information is put into the IEP, because that all is relevant. And rather than operating in silos, the skill set that we have as school psychs is the ability to collaborate, consult, and do that collaboration with our partners. So, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We do need to know what data exists, where to find it, and how to ask for it, and make sure that it's included in the student's plan. And yep, it ties so much into that 4-year plan. I will say this about Naviance. It's a great tool for students who can access it. And so we also have to be mindful of what are we doing for students who maybe don't have the reading ability, or that the accommodations that are provided, the accessibility in Naviance, is it appropriate for all of our students? And so what do we do for those students? We need to have kind of like our plan B and plan C, and that's where that individual transition plan form that I shared with you really comes into play, because you might have Naviance assessments that capture that. And that might be good for so many students, but you might find holes that Naviance doesn't capture. Conversely, for a student who can't access Naviance, you might need to fill in those holes with other assessments. And so that's where being aware of the range of assessments, what they all measure, how to use them is so important, because for some students that's going to be enough, and for others it won't. We are also doing work, a lot of districts through the ESSERS funds and through money that came out from PDE during the pandemic are using something called, and it just left my mind as soon as I wanted to talk to you about it, but give me a minute and I'll find it. Oh, I'm finding it. And it's for students with more significant unique learning systems, ULS. A lot of our sites took money from PDE to implement and buy ULS. And I think they could get additional money this year. So if your district is also utilizing unique learning systems or the Teach Town, there are other assessments, and those are geared towards students with more complex support needs. That there may be assessments and things that are being done through ULS that could also be incorporated into the students' transition planning. Those ULS ones tend to be really adapted, look more like picture exchange communication systems or PECs, and are more geared towards students, again, that have that more complex support needs as well. So that's another potential thing. There are lots of things that schools bought during the period when they were writing their comprehensive school counseling plans and had to publish that for the state, like Naviance. There are lots of other variations or different things like Naviance, Keys to Work, a couple other ones. Anything that's being done in your general education should be considered in the context of that individual student, and how does that assessment or information relate to their unique transition planning needs. And so, yep, I yes, Naviance, but remember the limitations as well. What to do when during an interview you end up being the first person to let the student know they receive special education. Yeah, that's a unique experience. One of the things that I would recommend actually lives on our patent site. And a lot of times people don't tell a student for a variety of reasons, right? Families might think that the student will feel less about themselves. They might have never thought to tell the student that they have a disability by any means of omission. And for right, wrong, or ugly, sometimes we are the ones that accidentally spill the beans, right, and say that. And I'll give an example. I work on the Achieve project, and Achieve is the program for students with disabilities like autism and developmental disabilities that have a plan of attending college. And we're in this Achieve meeting. It's a very problem-solving thing. And I said something about, well, or no, the intermediate unit tax said, well, you know, this is common in kids with autism. And the young man stopped and he's like, I have autism. I mean, this kid is 16. We are in a whole grant giving the school money. The parents are sitting in the room, or I think they were on the phone, and the money is all specific to individuals with autism attending college. He's 16 and he didn't know he had autism. And he, you know, it worked out okay. Like, he was like, well, that explains so much. And like, it worked out well, but it doesn't always work out beautifully like that. And it can result in feelings that are difficult. But from a transition lens, one of the most important things I can say, we actually have a resource on the patent website under publications. They're family-friendly one-page guides. And the one is on trying to find it, sorry. The difference in ADA versus IDEA, entitlement versus eligibility. That's the title of it. And that resource is a really nice one, because a lot of times the resistance comes from thinking that we're doing them a favor by not telling them about their disability. And why this tool is really nice is because it helps to facilitate that conversation about the differences between getting and being entitled to free and appropriate public education versus being eligible for services. And so what are those differences that exist in general between IDEA, ADA, and 504? And and who is responsible for requesting it. So I tend to use this tool to work with youth and families, especially families, to say, you know, it's important for your student to be a part of their IEP. I had parents who would flat out refuse for their student to attend their IEP meeting. And I would pull this tool out because I would say, you know, I understand your reluctance. It's intimidating. We don't want people to feel like they're lesser because they have a disability, but it's important for them to know so that they can, when the time comes, request, access, and get the services and accommodations that they're going to need. Because when the IEP ends, and in the medical model, when that student turns 18, they're not talking to you, mom and dad. They don't want to talk to you. The college is going to hang up on you if you call them and say, well, Erica had an IEP in high school and she got extended time on tests. They don't want to hear it from you, mom and dad. They want to hear it from the student. So this tool is a nice tool to be able to kind of facilitate that conversation in an ongoing basis, specific to requesting and discussing accommodations and who's responsible. So right here, student, right, becomes responsible. Person with a disability becomes the person responsible. So it is a nice tool in that way. And I think I saw more questions coming through, Erica.
Yeah, there's another question that popped through. I did link that. Hopefully the link worked in the chat. What are your thoughts on continuing to include cognitive testing as part of post-secondary planning, specifically in cases where you have a fairly stable IQ score established? Thinking about the benefits of dropping this in some scenarios to possibly free up time for other transition-focused assessment.
So Adina did my work for me, and she answered that. There are times when that is going to be specifically requested of schools, because either OVR is going to need an updated IQ test for the work that they're going to do with the student. Developmental disabilities offices are going to need that work, or is sometimes even in order to access accommodations on things like the college boards, SATs, ACTs. So I don't think you need to update an IQ test every single time you do a reevaluation, but typically within a year or two of a student exiting, if the student is connected to other agencies, they are going to want an updated IQ test. I'm not great at the awkward pause and silence for wait time, but I I will continue to work on that skill.
And while we are waiting for folks to do their questions in the chat, I will just reiterate, I know some of you, there were some issues with the link. We sincerely apologize. This session is recorded, so we will link it. Yeah, so I can link that on the Padlet. We also have a patent YouTube, and I can link that to if you Google patent YouTube, you'll see tons of videos across all our initiatives. But I also should be able to have that linked to our school psychology webpage. We're working on building that up. So again, thanks everyone for your patience. We will, at the conclusion here, give a survey, fingers crossed it should work, and a code for attendance, and we're not gonna penalize you. We will award credit. We know some of you did join late. There were some issues with the link and the code. It was okay for some, but not others. So you'll be able to access the full recording and still seek credit.
Okay, I see one that came directly to me, Erica. What do I see as the district's role in providing these assessments for other agencies? Is the responsibility to provide these assessments going to land on the agencies or within the school district? I go back to the idea that transition is an interagency collaborative process. And I know it's frustrating because it feels like a lot of the weight lands on the school systems. But it does slow down accessing services if they have to wait until after they leave the school system to get those evaluations, because those will get done. If they wait till they leave the school system to do it, it gets done through a neuropsych. And I'm just going to be honest, in the Western region, I can tell you that a neuropsych waitlist is like 13 months at this point. So it can be, by schools not doing the assessment, it can become a barrier to accessing other services that are needed. So my suggestion is to adequately plan and prepare to make sure that students who are going to need an IQ test, so those are going to tend to fall more around the students who are going to need more intensive. It's not going to be for every student, but that are going to need access to OVR or Office of Intellectual Disabilities, supports coordination kinds of services after they leave. So be aware of maybe who's bubbling on that caseload and take a proactive approach to spreading those out over the last couple years that they're there. That's where I think it's really helpful to know what the plan is for that student as well, because an exit point for some students is going to be their senior year, but for other students, they may be staying on through 21. So how can you spread those assessments out across the years by when they might be exiting, so that you allow for no disruption in services, because really that's the end result, is but that by not doing it, it leads to disruption in services. It was a good question.
Another question just popped in. It's fortunate that districts have transition supervisors. How much weight does Patton and OSAP put on districts having a transition program?
So I'll say this, I'm going to answer it in two ways. The requirement is in the special ed plan that the LEA designates a person. So that is the compliance requirement, right? How that looks, what that looks like is left to the LEA. What I will say about it is that this current bureau director is really invested in secondary transition. Both Carol Clancy and Amy Pastrick are very dedicated to transition, and some work that's coming out of Patton over the next couple years is on attracting, preparing, and retaining staff in education in general. So teachers, paraeducators, school psychs, school counselors, administrators. But in that vein, it's transition as well. And so the Bureau has committed a ton of money to grants through the Transition Initiative to look at transition programming. This year, we've run 2 grants. We've run the Competitive Integrated Employment Grants, and that for establishing sites, it was $30,000 per LEA, and it was $15,000 if they were extending. So you can do an extension grant if you got a first year grant. You can get a second year grant if you reapply and are accepted. So up to $45,000 over 2 years for competitive integrated employment grants. And then we've had the Transition Discoveries grants, which has been $7,500 a year for 2-year implementation. We are looking to integrate those into one, I call it like the super grant, to be more thoroughly and comprehensively aligned with looking at transition programs. We've done some work in transition at the Bureau's request on, and we will have available for paraeducators in schools next year, a Schoology course on job coaching and how to work as a job coach as a paraeducator. So that's specific to transition. And then in terms of programming in general, we're really committed to using the Transition Discoveries framework to help sites, look at what are we doing in a continuum of transition services, so that we're not just throwing a coffee cart for students with disabilities in a building, but we're really looking at planning and family engagement and person-centered planning and youth engagement and post-secondary education, looking at all of those pieces through Transition Discoveries to really build more specific requirements. The other piece is that right now there is no specific training that's required. We are looking and working with the Bureau for considerations for competencies, kind of like the paraeducator competencies for people doing transition, and with the hope of one day that it turns into a certification in the same way that you are certified as a school psychologist or as a special educator or as an administrator, looking at that existing for transition coordinator as well. There are some programs in Pennsylvania and at George Washington's another example that have certification programs specific to transition. So if it does fall on you, you might want to think about those courses, but we are looking to build that within Pennsylvania as well. Ultimately, I'll say this, and I said this at the beginning, it shouldn't be one person's job. It's a coordinated effort. And anybody who contributes to the IEP can be called to due process and asked to answer questions about what's the contents of that IEP are. So it does fall on the case manager in some instances to make sure that those compliance pieces are checked, that transition is done appropriately. So having people be aware of those requirements is really important. I can't stress that enough. So if it's you, if you're the case manager, then be aware and make sure that everybody that's contributing to that ERRR or IEP understand their role and how that relates to those requirements as well. The Schoology job coaching course is going to be offered through the patent training calendar next year. So it'll come out like a training announcement, like our other trainings. I think we're looking to offer it at several points throughout the year next year. So keep an eye on the transition tidbits. I would kind of suggest you can go on the PA secondary transition under the announcements, and you can actually subscribe to receive the transition tidbits directly to your inbox, because anything that we're announcing specific to transition will go out on that. Okay, am I missing anything, Erica?
Just a few other comments about updating ABAS or Vineland, autism rating scales for ID/ASD services, some tips about New Jersey, just had a private one. Students who have significant physical and cognitive disabilities who are in a multi-disability support classroom need some more in transition services and activities than just what OVR provides.
Yeah, so for students with complex support needs, I'll actually add this to this Padlet, but I'll actually link a Padlet to a Padlet because this is going to be a really nice, I have like 75 Padlet accounts. But on this, during the pandemic, we created a Padlet that has a ton of different transition resources based on either IEP goal area, students with complex support needs, and the career education and work standards. So I'll actually link this to the Padlet, but the University of Kansas has some really great resources specific to students with complex support needs. So they have different toolkits, videos, the Good Day Plan, that's like a planning tool, creating visual resumes, using choice boards. The choice board one was probably one of the best trainings that I've seen. So how can you use choice boards to help students with disabilities decide about transition activities? Different videos that are more appropriate, different Google tools, lots of different resources here that would help with students with more complex support needs. So I agree, they definitely need a little bit more specific and focused. One of the things that I think is so important to understand is that students with disabilities that like even complex support needs should be referred to OVR because they can't access services within the waiver system through Office of Developmental Programs or any other type of more restricted employment like customized or supported employment until they're deemed ineligible by OVR. So that like OVR referral is so important because they're either going to be found eligible to work with OVR or they're going to be found to need more intensive supports that can be provided by another entity like ODP or the Office of Long-Term Living. And without that kind of rejection letter from OVR saying no, not now, they can't begin to access those other services. So just something to think about too, to have an awareness of, because it is really important for those individuals to have access to anything that they need. So I added that Padlet to the Padlet. It's like our school psych thing. We make Padlets of Padlets.
That's right.
But there's tons of resources on there. I could have spent an entire webinar just going through all the different resources. During the pandemic, lots of the disability service offices offered virtual tours of all the different colleges. So there's how to access the disability services offices and how to tour. I mean, just tons of good things on here that can be used across the continuum.